they were hard to drive. They were extraordinarily powerful.
Suddenly you had a big car that stopped and kept stopping and handled. And nothing else had done that until then.
The cars gobbled fuel, went very fast, wore out tyres and brakes at a very, very high rate. But they were just wonderful beasts of motorcars. And to drive them on the road was almost as exciting as driving on them on the racetrack.
He's going to finish so far in front. Flag. Moffat is through. He is first.
It was a GT Falcon on steroids. It was just a bigger, tougher, faster racing version of the GT. And again, that was built with one purpose in mind, win Bathurst.
The legend of the Falcon GT just grew, you know, and the HO, handling options, and the shakers and all this sort of stuff. I mean, blokes were giving up sex to have those cars.
In 1966, Ford released a new sedan they called the Mustang-bred Falcon, the XR. In the following year, it introduced a high-performance version bearing the GT badge for the first time. It was powered by a 289 cubic-inch V8 producing 169 kilowatts, with a sensational top speed of nearly 200 kilometres an hour. It only came in one colour, gold, and it created a sensation.
The current fellas who drive think how terrible they were, but you've got to remember we were in an era that we're used to ordinary tyres and ordinary brakes and ordinary handling cars, and even though they were a production car, Ford had gone to a lot of expense and problems to make them, the GTs, a lot better car, and I didn't find anything wrong with them. But mind you, if you got out of a supercar into one of them now, you'd probably think, boy, these aren't so good. But that's just like getting out of my car at the moment and getting back into a 1967 model of any car.
"56 feet, tread on the pedal, and some $100,000 surges forward in a blue haze of burnt rubber.
The GT was considered perfect for the 500-mile Bathurst Enduro, the Gallagher 500. And that year, 7 of the new cars were entered.
When the XR GTs, the first Falcon GTs arrived at Bathurst, people had never seen anything like this. You think how sleepy the Australian motoring scene was before the first Falcon GT arrived. This car just set a whole new benchmark. And it really was extraordinary. People had never seen anything like this before. Not only the performance, the fact you had a powerful V8 Falcon, but the paint job, you know, the stripes, the gold paint, the chrome wheels. This was real hot rodding stuff, and no one had ever seen anything like this from Ford Motor Company in this country.
And here's that vital...
Among the starters was a factory-entered machine prepared and driven by the vastly experienced Harry Firth and a 21-year-old rookie called Fred Gibson.
I was very lucky to get that drive because the drive was going to go to Frank Maddich. And Frank got stuck in America with a Can-Am race. And I knew Frank pretty well because I had a sports car and used to use Goodyear tyres, and he was the Goodyear tyre agent. And Frank said, I can't get back because they cancelled the Can-Am race and they had to stay. And they said, well, who are we going to do? Get the foot in the car. And he said, well, this young guy who drives a sports car, I think it's going very well. Give him a ring and give him the drive. I think he'll go well. So the guy from Ford in Sydney rang me and said, we're going to drive this car with Harry Firth at Bathurst. I said, me? Like this? And they said, yeah. I said, gee, yeah, I'll be in that. And it's amazing, Charles, how things happen. I said, yeah, I'll do that. And you don't hear any more about it. Well, you got the drive and we'll see you at Bathurst. And I said, well, you know, and I said, well, can I have a drive with one of these cars before I get to Bathurst? Oh, yeah. So they got a press car and I drove around the streets a bit in it. And like, that's the way I drove this GT for the first time. And that was fine. I thought, oh, well, yeah, OK. I went to Bathurst and I said, what do I do? I said, oh, Harry's staying at the, I think, Abercrombie in Bathurst or something, I think it was in those days. Go and see Harry on Friday when you get in and see Harry. I never met Harry before in my life. So I drove to Bathurst and knocked on this motel, and Harry's there. Fred Gibson, oh yeah, come in. And we said, so we're chatting away, good to meet you and all that sort of thing. And I said, Harry, how are we going to go? Because this is the first time like a V8's run at Bathurst, because it's usually Alphas and Cougars and that, Minis and that. And he said, I will win the race. I will win the race. Good, Harry. That's pretty positive to start with, isn't it? He said, Cock, there is no substitute for cubic capacity. He said, we'll win the race. You do what I tell you to do and we'll win this race. Right, okay. And we did. He did.
2/3 gone, Forest Elbow, and the three big Falcons, Stillgagan, Gibson, Martin, open a sizable lead on the field.
I went and practiced the car and qualified it, and I think we were the first car to break 3 minutes round there. And he said, well done, Cock, well done, well done. So that's okay, that was all right. And then the thing is, in the race, like I think he started, or I don't know who started, but in the race, he hung over the fence, and because there was a wooden fence at Bathurst those days, and there was no radios or anything. And there's Harry hanging over the fence going. And I thought, God, he must want me to go faster. And it's amazing how Charles, I thought I was working my freckle off, doing as best I could, driving this thing as hard as he wanted me to drive it, and all of a sudden he's telling me to go faster. It's amazing when something like that happens, you can find more speed. And I thought, and then he come out and I've cut my laps, he wanted me to get a gap on the car, whatever. And I just amazing how you find time around a circuit when the bosses hung over the fence said go faster. And I learned a lot probably in my career on that first meeting with Harry and racing with Harry.
But these are the dying moments when drivers talk to their machines, coax them round. Here's the actual difference between Gibson and Gagan on the last lap. Gibson is the dark car up front. Holders, and you'll see Gagan in 53.
Although Gibson and Firth won the race, their victory wasn't initially recognised because of a mistake in lap scoring that had the Gagan brothers crossing the line first in another GT Falcon.
Up in the tower, the cross-checking ARDC execs now more than suspect they've made a boo-boo.
What they did originally was they awarded the race win to Leo and Pete Gagan in another XR Falcon. But there was a huge kerfuffle after the race when Harry Firth, who was driving with Fred Gibson, he protested. He said the lap scorers had got it wrong. And after they did like an hour or 2 hours, I don't know how long it was, they went through their books and they realised that Harry was right. What had happened was that during the race, Pete Gagan had come up pit straight, turned into Hell Corner to go up Mountain Straight, and the car was running out of fuel. So he thought, I'm not going to make another lap. So he turned into the road. It was about halfway up Conrod Straight, drove into the back of the pits, down through the paddock, and into the pit apron to refuel. Now, what happened was the lap scorers thought that he'd done another lap. So in actual fact, they were awarded the win, but they were behind the Gibson Firth car, not in front.
Weeks later, officials rectified their mistake, but this was no real compensation for not being winner on the day.
I was disappointed the way it finished, because as you know, it finished, we didn't get the checkered flag at the finish, theoretically, we won after on the lap score. But it was for me in my career, like I was nobody. I was like this young kid racing the car on my own money and that sort of things, and that's before Ford Motor Company and everything. So I was driving this car, and all of a sudden I got the opportunity to drive this Falcon with Harry Firth, who was a guru.
The XR Falcon's production run ended in February 1968 with nearly 85,000 being built, including 596 GTs. The new XT Falcon was released in April, with the GT version getting a larger 302 cubic inch V8 and a choice of colours and transmissions. It had only marginally more power with 171 kilowatts, but was faster and more refined.
Ford were the first to decide to build a production racing car in the Falcon GT back in 1967. And it really was a racing car. It had to be a road car, first of all, to be able to race at Bathurst. And Bathurst, by that stage of the game, was starting to become quite an important event to win. And Ford, in 1965, had brought out the Cortina GT500 as a production modified version of the ordinary Cortina GT. It was specifically to race at Bathurst. The next step was to go to the Falcon. And that brought out then an entire train of Falcon GTs that Holden, even though Holden were not involved in motor racing, Holden decided that they had to do something about it. So we first of all had the Monaro in 68 and 69, and then we went into the Tirana era. But that was really 1968 was the first head-on clash between the two big motorcar manufacturers in this country.
Only minutes to starting time in Australia's toughest race for standard sedan cars. In the Ford camp, the Gagan brothers, Leo and Pete, sporting a new crash helmet, are confident of better luck than in past 500s. They were flagged in first last year, but lost on a recount of laps. Pole position on the grid following fastest practice times yesterday are the new Holden Monaros.
"1968 saw the first Hardy-Ferodo 500 at Bathurst, with 8 Falcons and 8 Holden Monaros taking part.
By the time they reach the S's, Des West's Holden Monaro number 14 has hit the front, followed by the Holdens of Hawkins, Muir and Palmer. Then the Falcons of Gagan and Gibson.
There were 3 Works GTs, the Gagans, Fred Gibson with Barry Seaton, and Jim McEwen with Spencer Martin in an automatic version.
Gagan and Gibson. Meanwhile, the front runners have reached the halfway mark, and following pit stops by all, there's been a change of leaders. Car 9, the Gibson Seaton Falcon, has hit the front, followed by Car 8, the Gagan Falcon. Leo's going to try and go the distance without a brake change, as he did last year when only narrowly beaten. The time saved could win the race for him this year. And in the pits, co-driver of the leading car, Fred Gibson, confidently leaves the worries of staying in front to Barry Seaton.
The Seaton-Gibson car was leading the race with less than 20 laps remaining when a stone punctured the radiator and caused a cruel engine failure.
A quarter of an hour later, it's the leader, Barry Seaton, in with a suspected blown head gasket. Time is running out, and every second vital. A radiator refill, some rapid cooling, and the car is sent back onto the track.
The Gagans also suffered troubles after trying to run the full distance without a brake pad change and running out of front brakes.
The Falcon's disc brakes burn out. Replacement takes 16 minutes.
The new Holden Monaro GTS 327, driven by Bruce McPhee and Barry Mulholland, ended up winning the race. It marked the beginning of Holden-Ford rivalry on the mountain.
67 we won Bathurst, and 68 we led Bathurst against the Monaros, and we led the race, and that was one of the hardest races that Barry and I ever did, because the car was outpowered by the Monaro, but we had to work out where we'd pass the Monaro to keep in front across the top of the mountain to gain time, because the car handled better, and gain time across the top to hold them off down the mountain. And we did that during the day, and we led with 20 laps to go or something, and they got a stone through the radiator and cooked the engine, so we could have won that race. But then with the Falcons and the Monaro, with the Windsor motors, we were really competitive and we were winning races still. Then the Cleveland engines where we went downhill sort of thing.
New Falcon is here. The all excitement happening at your Ford dealers.
In the following year, Ford introduced a new XW Falcon with a faster, more powerful GT model. And with Bathurst in mind, there was also a new premium performance version of the GT, designated the GTHO.
By 1969, the battle for Bathurst supremacy between Ford, Holden and Chrysler was really starting to hot up, and Ford raised the performance bar to new heights with creation of this car, the first Falcon GTHO with the distinctive Subaru decals on the front mudguards. Now, the HO was based on the GT, but it was an out-and-out Bathurst special built by Al Turner's Special Vehicles division. Now, the first phase of the GTHO program introduced the new, more powerful 5.8-litre Windsor V8 engine, a long-range fuel tank and much improved suspension and brakes. Interesting point, the HO letters originally stood for high output, but they were changed to handling options just before release to try and cap some insurance premiums that were going through the roof on these cars.
I knew that Ford were developing a car, and eventually we were able to obtain one of those cars, and it in fact was a standard Starlight Blue GTHO, as I remember. And so when we got the car, of course, we knew that these cars were going to be a bit special, but I had a, two-handed view of it, because I wondered just what we would find when we actually got them onto a circuit. In any case, the first real impression I had of that car was following our decision to drive it over some considerable distance to just condition it and bed it in. I remember leaving Rockdale the day or so after we received it from Melbourne, and I drove up through the city, round South Dowling Street and onto the expressway. It was a wet, mid-morning, wet, slippery morning, and I remember the thing slid sideways, and this is on a city street, and I hadn't driven it more than 2 or 3 miles, you know, and I thought, God, these things are going to be a handful on a circuit, because remember, it was a series production car, and in theory at least, we were not supposed to be able to change anything. So that was the first impression I had. A lot of torque, and by today's standards, a clumsy car to drive, but nevertheless there was some, for its time, it was quite an exciting car to drive, but a lot of oversteer.
Al, have Fords built a special car to win Bathurst this year?
Oh, not really. There's been quite a bit of controversy about this, whether or not it's been a special car, but we consider it a normal progression in our, what we term as a performance vehicle.
The HO come along and a guy called Al Turner come along. And Al was the brazen American that worked at Ford Motor Company in Detroit, and he was the man that did all the dragsters over there and that, and he was the car that was going to set the world on fire in Australia. So we started out with a HO, but then we sort of, and I was very successful in the HOs, particularly in Sydney. I had a Sydney car, I drove for Ford. I had a works car I drove with Moffat, and I had a Sydney car. I run out of my own workshop in Sydney and did all the Oran Parks, Amaru Parks and those sorts of things. And we become over the years with the HO pretty dominant in that sort of racing in Sydney. One series had #1 on the car. I was a guru in New South Wales sort of thing, and my business was really mechanical business, and I was just inundated with Falcon GT owners wanting their cars worked on, so I was making money as well out of it.
Well, the first time I was involved with Ford was in 1969, and they flew me down to Melbourne, and that was just before Sandown, in the same week actually, and I walked into their workshop there, and of course we'd never seen anything as professional as this before, being in Queensland, and I walked in and there were these 3 red or whatever, violet, whatever colour they call it, sitting there like a professional racing team, and it was quite impressive when I thought about that I was going to be driving one of them at Sandown that year.
The GTHO was an extraordinary development. When you think of how the GT development had gone, XR GT, XT GT, and then you got to the XW model, that wasn't enough. They wanted to build a super high-performance version, and the whole purpose of building that car was to win Bathurst. That's how important Bathurst was, and that's why the place has that mystique these days. Winning Bathurst was the most important thing for a car manufacturer in those days, and I think Ford were really at the head of pushing that bar up further and further. But they did have their first race at Sandown. They were immediately successful.
Moffat had been in Australia a couple of years then and was making a name for himself as a competitor. Yes, couldn't have had a better drive. And I was actually very fortunate to get it because Al Turner, the American who was running it, was looking around for a driver for Moffat, and Pete Gagan said, well, you want to get Frenchie? He's not too bad. So that's how I got the drive.
Also of the Ford Motor Company, the Ford Falcon GTHO.
Sandown was to be the first competitive outing for the new GTHOs in September 1969 at the Datsun 3-hour race. The new cars had the perfect debut, finishing 1, 2, 3. With Canadian-born works driver Alan Moffat and Queensland's John French leading the way.
I wasn't doing this professionally, so I wasn't as excited about it as Alan was, but when we won and they did a lap of honour for us with him and I sitting on the bonnet or something, he said, I can't believe we won this. I said, why? He said, oh, God, he said, this is the best thing that's happened to me since I've been here. And I said, oh, OK, but, you know, it was... I'd been fortunate enough that I'd won a few races from when I started in 1957, and you know it was just another race, and we were lucky and we won it.
Congratulations. A very fine drive. Thank you.
The worst part about racing in those days, and something that our authorities took quite a while to come to grips with, was just flopping around in the seat. It was a nightmare.
By their standards in their day, they were fantastic. By today's standards, it's just like now getting out of a contemporary motor car or a contemporary sports car and getting into an MGTC, and you say to yourself, why on earth did I want to buy this?
They were hard cars to drive. Like I drove a Phase 3 at Sandown a few years ago for some guy. I don't know why I ever did it because I've never done anything since. And I just wondered how we ever drove them. I said to the guy, you're a hero driving this car. It is bad to drive. you know, because we've moved on now, but they were seriously bad cars. When you come down the straight at 140 mile an hour in these things on the old Bathurst Straight, and you come across, and sometimes you're coming down to pass a slow car and you're looking at the windsock, at a windsock at Bathurst, which way the wind was blowing on the straight, and you come down three wide passing small cars. You had to know which way the wind was blowing and give yourself enough room to, because it'll lift you off the ground and move you across the track. They were seriously fast motor cars. But then you get to the end of the straight, and because the drum brakes in the back, after maybe like halfway through the race, the back brakes were useless. So you used to come down, and we used to have this saying where you have your foot hard on the throttle coming down the straight, and you give the brake pedal with your left foot 4 with the left and 2 with the right. So you had to pump the pedal up. So you're coming in the straight and you've got your foot hard down, you're doing 140 mile an hour, and you've got your left foot coming across to pump the brake pedal up, not putting the brake on, just to pump the pedal up and get the pedal pumped up. And then when you get in the braking area, you go to the clutch and put your foot off the throttle on the brake and give it a pump and stop the car. And that's what you did for half the race. And like a lot of people, as you see probably in those Bathurst films, they went off the track under brakes and that because they had no brakes. They just burnt them right out. But Moffat was a master, and he was probably the best. Moffat, to me, Alan wasn't even though he's a personal friend and everything, he wasn't a natural driver like a Pete Gagan. Moffat was a thinking driver. Alan was the sort of driver that had to think about it, had to suss the thing, suss the circuit, have a ponder about it, and psych himself up to drive it. But he was brilliant at that, and in a race he was marvellous at looking after the tyres and the brakes and the whole thing. And he would work himself hard and wear himself out, because you see Alan get out of a car after a long day, he was absolutely knackered, he was worn out because he'd worked himself hard.
The largest crowd in the history of the race has come to see what promises to be the most thrilling motor race of its kind ever staged, with main interest in the battle for line honours between the new and specially built Ford Falcon GTHOs and the car that won convincingly last year, the Holden Monaro GTS.
By the time Bathurst came around in 1969, it seemed everyone wanted to drive a GTHO. 14 were entered in the great race, with 3 works cars driven by Alan Moffat and Alan Hamilton, Fred Gibson and Barry Seaton, and of course the Flying Gagan brothers.
That was the Windsor engine HOs, and the cars were dominant. They really were dominant. They had the Monaros. We had more power. We had a better package. The car was a better package. One of the worst things with the car was the drum rear brakes. But the car was a good car, and I think Moffat and I, we were 1, 2, 3 or something at one stage there.
The Gagan car is pacemaker at XL Corner, and their speed up the mountain is nearly as fast as last year's going down.
The Falcons had dominated practice, but some didn't get past the first lap when a major crash involving Bill Brown's GTHO entangled a quarter of the field. When the dust settled and the track was cleared, the Falcons continued to lead the new Holden Monaro GTS 350s. But a decision to try new Goodyear racing tyres would prove costly for the Ford team.
Bill Brown still in the car, actually. John Fred, at least Bill Stanley making his car up, letting Bartlett Salford through. But still,
the main problem with the Ford attack at Bathurst in 1969 wasn't really the speed of the cars. Those first HOs were very, very quick cars, there was no doubt about it. But Al Turner, who was the competition boss in those days, he wanted to do everything right. He wanted to give his teams and his cars every chance of victory. So what he did was import a large batch of these latest Goodyear racing tyres from the US. Now, the way I understand it is that Alan Moffat, was the only man who tested these tyres when they were determining whether they'd be suitable for Bathurst. Now, the problem was that Moffat was a master of throttle control, a master of keeping the car straight, a master of driving these series production cars. So based on his testing feedback, those tyres were fine. But what they found when they got to Mount Panorama, that the other drivers who perhaps didn't have the same sort of throttle sensitivity, the same sort of finesse that Moffat had, they were burning these tyres up left, right and centre, and there were blowouts all over the place, and that really brought the whole Ford attack undone. It's interesting, though, that out of all those cars, Al Turner brought Alan Moffat in because he was concerned. He'd seen all these tyres blowing and he said, I can't leave Moffat out there. But as they found after the race, that Moffat's tyres were actually in very, very good shape. And if Turner had left him on the track, he could well have won that race.
One of the things that we implemented instantly that year was a racing tire. It still had a tread pattern, and this was fine, but my teammates hadn't actually had the luxury of this type of tire on a production touring car before. And not to be unkind, but just facts are facts, they hammered the tires too hard, and both the two team cars in front of me had blowouts with rather dramatic results.
Holden tactics are to push the GTHOs, making their drivers keep foot to floor and brake as much as possible. So with every GTHO, there's a GTS close behind. Down in the pits, too, the Falcons are in trouble. A tyre blowout brings Harry Gaps in for much-needed attention. More trouble. This time it's the leader, Pete Gagan, and he's also had a blowout, but still speeding to the pits. Leo is to take over, but this unscheduled stop could cost the race. It was expected the specially imported tyres would only be changed once, but now there must be another stop.
And Al Turner rightly called me in thinking that I was also in danger, when in fact my tires were in good shape, and if I hadn't have had that premature pit stop, I do believe Alan Hamilton and I could have gone on to get our first victory up there, but I just had to wait a year.
Another driver having his first outing in the new GTHO was Sydney privateer John Goss, but he too had problems and couldn't finish.
I don't think I had any real expectations in terms of winning the race. My first expectation was to try and get some experience in this category. That was really the primary expectation I had. And as it was, in our first Bathurst 500 it was, Dennis Cribben and I went into it with the best commitment we could make, but Dennis lost control sometime into the race, probably a third of the way in, and hit the bank, left the car, but returned to the car and drove it back to the pits. And that meant, of course, that we were disqualified. So we were out of our first 500 before we'd gone very far at all. We probably covered 150 miles or something like that. Although in balance, I'd completed 60 laps of Bathurst, and that was invaluable experience.
The series production touring car race, 34 laps, 76.5 miles, and the coveted pole position in this very big field is car number 32, a Ford Falcon GTHO, to be driven by Alan Moffat of Victoria.
In the first half of 1970, the GTHO, later referred to as the Phase 1, was campaigned successfully in series production racing, especially by Moffat and Gibson, who won many races in the car.
And away they go, anticipating the flag a little. A very even start, and Gagan on the outside in 31, wrenching for second gear, is still level with Moffat as they go around. There's no way for the Holdens to go anywhere, and this is the formation appearing. Moffat slips to the lead, Gagan tucks in behind him on the inside in third place.
Phase 1 was a great car. It was a Windsor, it was hydraulic lifters, it was up against the 327 Monaros, it was better than them, it was up against the 350 Monaro, it was better than them. I won the Hume Weir race and our race with Brock in the 350 Monaro. Bobby Morris was in the 350 Monaro. I beat them in Sydney in the Sydney races. And in Bathurst and that, they won in Bathurst and that as well. But the thing is, so as a Windsor engine car before the Cleveland car, when the Phase 3 started and those sorts of things, that's when we started to have troubles, yeah.
Bond out of the picture at the bottom, and Moffat across the picture at the top. Shuffling the wheel there, making sure he doesn't get too sideways and spin.
Ford's agony at losing the 1969 Bathurst race only intensified the company's win-at-all-costs approach. For 1970, it brought out this car, the XW GTHO Phase 2, with an even more powerful 5.8-litre V8 engine sourced from its US engine plant in Cleveland, Ohio. Now, the combination of the new engine plus a year's testing certainly did the trick. This actual car was driven to victory by Alan Moffat at Bathurst in 1970.
The new Phase 2 GTHO was released in August 1970. Bathurst was the major target, and once more, 14 Phase 2s made it to the mountain.
Taking advantage of the pole position, Moffat leads up Mountain Straight, with Bond skillfully manoeuvring into second place ahead of Seaton and McPhee. Speculation about Ford's tactics is rife. There are those who feel Moffat will attempt to break up the field, especially as he's backed up by McPhee and Seaton. But the majority are convinced he'll drive only as fast as the dictates of the race demand.
These cars were very fast, with a sub-15-second standing quarter time. and a claimed top speed of over 230 kilometres an hour.
There were times when you had to use all your judgment in trying to negotiate slower cars at such a high closing speed on what was effectively a narrow country road. And it's worth remembering as well that the edges, the verges and the edges of the circuit were really just that, country road post and rail fences and concrete culverts and stuff like that, and gravel verges. And if it rained, uncontrolled drainage over certain sections of the road along the top of the mountain. So it was, you were driving a road car basically with a lot of energy on a country road stretch in New South Wales on hopefully a nice Sunday afternoon, and you were driving it bloody quick and trying to avoid running into other competitors and staying off the hardware, you know. But that was quite a commitment driving them at speed.
After 5 laps, Moffat regains the overall lead. Resisting Bond's challenge to an early duel, Moffat instead concentrates on pre-race set speeds. Maintaining the form that took him to success in the Tasman Series at Warwick Farm and the Sandown 3-hour race prior to Bathurst, Moffat's control and handling is giving him scope to virtually dominate the 500. Even at such an early stage, it seems only bad luck could rob him of victory.
It was about the first time anyone had ever been under 3 minutes at Bathurst, and I think from memory, Moffat was done a 50 or 51, 250 or 251 or something like that. And I was a bit slower, but the cars had improved a considerable amount.
Excitement surrounds Moffat's first scheduled pit stop after 45 laps. As new tyres are being fitted on the Gtho and fuel replenished by a well-drilled pit crew, Des West's 4-barrel pacer flashes past to take over the lead. But Alterna is unperturbed.
We've made our first stop with Bruce McPhee, and it took 2 minutes and 9 seconds to change 3 tires, and we put in 25 gallons of fuel. We've got Moffat fueled up again with 4 tires and 25 gallons, and they're both out now. And we'll just have to see how it goes.
Although the new GTHOs were fast in qualifying, filling the top 3 places on the Bathurst grid, race reliability would prove to be a problem. Fred Gibson suffered differential trouble, while 5 other Phase 2 drivers were forced out with engine failure.
There weren't specialist engineers like Ron Harrop and the gearbox people that just had everything perfected. People were getting bits from all over the place and so on. And these guys were stretching cars hard. But the other thing was this. There were not the electronics to look after them. So Formula One cars blew up. Everything blew up because some drivers overdrove them, some teams didn't prepare them as well, sometimes you had bad luck, sometimes you got bad rods or valves or whatever. So, you know, there were less perfect days. These days, the electronics... I mean, a person in Japan knows as much more about what's going on in a Honda Formula One engine driving in the Grand Prix at this moment than does the driver Jensen Button in the car, and can say, switch off, park the car, don't destroy it. Because I know the oil pressure or the temperature or whatever, or the power in one cylinder or whatever is being affected. There was nothing like that in those days.
We were a private team, and I remember that we had to try and deal with running engines in, you know. This was the age before chassis dynamometers and stuff like that. And one great, an overnight panic at Bathurst when we were based in the Ford dealership, Clancy Motors, and we were there with a number of other Ford teams. And after practice in '70, most of the bloody Phase 2s had piston failure. And there was a hell of a... I mean, you had a piston failure in your own engine, and you thought, God, we better go away and deal with that quietly. And then you got back to the garage and you found everybody had the same problem, you know. But there were Phase 2s all over the place with pistons pulled out of them, and dealer principals, cars who, you know, people like Max Wright and Max McLeod had driven new GTHOs up to Bathurst. Well, they all fell down and sumps were being pulled off and pistons and rods. Anyway, we rebuilt our engine, and we took a set of 8 pistons and connecting rods from Max's personal car and fitted them in the engine. And we really wanted to run that engine for some distance before we had to face the start the next morning. And so I said to Bob, look, let's take it for a run out to Blaney, and then we'll cut across and go out to Orange. So by this time, it was probably 2 a.m. We went out to Blaney, back diagonally to the Western Highway, and we were heading west now, and I looked at the temperatures and pressures, and he was driving the car, and I said, look, you could increase the engine speed a bit, and we ran it up the speed range a bit, and we came to a little town called Lucknow. And I mean, as quick as I warned him about the speed limit sign, but as quickly as we saw it, it disappeared past us, you know. And inevitably, ironically, I looked around and there were two little headlights coming out of the side street, and I said, gee, I think there's a cop there, mate. And so we slowed down and pulled over, and a Mini S, Highway Patrol Mini S, ran up behind us and stopped. The policeman jumped out, put his hat on, and Bob said, I'll handle this. So he got out and walked around the back of the car and started talking to the cop. And I could hear that he was getting nowhere because the policeman was trying to, he was inferring we might have stolen the car. So I got out of the passenger seat and went around, and I convinced the policeman that it was our own operation and that we legitimately were trying to run this car in and so on. But it looked like a pretty heavy fine, and I said to this young cop, I said, have you ever driven in one of these things? And he said, no. I said, well, would you like to drive it into Orange? I said, Bob, you take the S. And that's what we did. He drove it into Orange, and he stopped. When we got near the town, he said, I think I better stop here. The boss might be out in his, patrol car. Anyway, that was a great story, and so we parted friends. And they were the sort of things that happened to us in those days when we were running these cars on public roads. And now and again, it wasn't... now and again, you'd get caught. And in this case, we didn't see a speeding sign, and that was a good story, to remember.
Moffat is right on schedule for his final pit stop, during which the crew makes their fastest turnaround.
Moffat, who'd been fastest in practice, chose to drive the entire 500-mile race distance solo. Unlike many other GTHO drivers, he managed to avoid major reliability problems. But Moffat did suffer in another way.
There was one problem that I hadn't counted on, and this was certainly towards about the 5-hour mark. Something started to get rather difficult to hold back, and had a pit stop, and in those days the pit stops were about 3 minutes, and I was determined that I had enough time to get my fly undone, and I didn't care where it was going to go. I just kept my feet up on the pedals so they didn't get wet, and I knew the floorboards would be hot enough to dissipate anything that was going to come out of me. And this was fine until I get a little knock on the window, and it's Adrian Ryan from Channel 7 saying, Alan, would you have a minute? And I would still love to see the look on my face that day, where I didn't dare stop what I was doing because that was too important, and I'm carrying on a conversation through the window at the same time. I didn't have time to get re-zipped up, and things were quite drafty on Conrod Straight for 3 or 4 laps until I could get myself back to the manner in which I started the race, shall we say.
In 1970, I think we both drove the race single-handed, and my remaining memory of that was going beyond those limits that I'd ever been before in terms of continuously driving a car on a circuit, and during the afternoon working at keeping, maintaining concentration and that sort of stuff, relying on some water and some chilled grapes I used to carry in the console, but really not having any difficulty beyond driving within what you reckon was your own physical limit. But when I got out of the car, after, I guess, 6 hours behind the wheel, 5.5 or 6 hours, I remember going to walk and I felt as though I was walking on my knees. I had no real feeling, no sense of balance. That's what it was, and that came back in a few minutes, of course. But it was it was satisfying to think that I'd completed that race single-handed, and Alan had done the same, I'm pretty sure. we both drove several of those events in these years on our own.
Moffat is cruising less than half a minute ahead of McPhee as the race reaches its closing stages. Roberts recaptures third place from Chivers with some attacking driving. But almost immediately after going over Skyline, Roberts' car spins and crashes backwards down a steep slope.
Another GTHO driver doing the race solo was privateer Tony Roberts, who failed to finish after surviving one of the most terrifying crashes ever seen on the mountain, when he left the circuit tail first over Skyline.
Officials and spectators rush down to render assistance, but although the car is a write-off, fortunately Roberts is only dazed. Moffat rounds Forest Elbow and heads for Conrod Strait for the last time. He leads McPhee and goes on to win from his teammate with Don Holland third, a lap behind.
Moffat's dominant performance to take out the race was a taste of things to come, and Ford, not content to rest on its laurels, seriously upped the ante in 1971.
The XY Falcon GTHO Phase 3 was the third and final phase of the HO program, and this car was the first to introduce the shaker scoop, which attached to the top of the engine through this hole in the bonnet, and it shook side to side when the engine was running, hence the famous name. Now, the Phase 3 certainly deserved its fearsome reputation. Alan Moffat demolished the field at Bathurst in 1971. This car over here was the top place privateer at Bathurst in 72, finishing second overall. And this car took Alan Moffat to victory in the 1973 Australian Touring Car Championship under the new Group C rules.
The only full-time professional in the race, Alan Moffat, with Ford Marketing Director Keith Horner. John French, backup driver to Moffat.
Moffat and I were the quickest in practice, and our duty was to just go round and round, and me following again. Probably I couldn't pass him anyhow, I don't know.
Those at the rear of the field battle for positions in the charge to Hardy for Rodo corner. Moffat powers up Mountain Straight, already out on his own. So solid is the pace, the field is fairly well spread out midway through the opening lap. Moffat is pursued by French and Mackay, who's improved one place on his grid position. Unleashing its newly developed power, Moffat accelerates the GTHO to something around 140 miles per hour down Conrod. French also has his foot down. Into pit straight, and Moffat sets about dictating the pattern of the race.
The Phase 3 GTHO was the ultimate GTHO, and it was the most powerful, it was the fastest, and certainly at Bathurst it was the most dominant. The extraordinary difference, I think, between the Phase 2 and the Phase 3 was Moffat in practice or official qualifying for the 1971 race. He went out there and he just sucked the doors off everyone else in the field. I think his time was something like 13 seconds faster than the lap record from the previous year, which gives you some idea of how much faster the Phase 3 was.
The Falcons increase their margin over the smaller cars, who, whilst having a cornering advantage, are outsped on the straights.
The Phase 3 was a pretty useful sort of a car, and particularly with the globe wheels. By now, I think at Bathurst we were running up to a terminal speed of about 148 miles an hour, pretty quick in those days. And I can remember, might have been during practice or the event, at Bathurst, strong crosswinds. And at that speed, these were basic elementary touring cars in essence. And I can remember trying to judge to get up to windward of a class car as we closed on them down the straight. And on 2 or 3 occasions, I can remember cresting one of the intermediate humps, coming out into open air, and the car being set across the circuit with a stiff crosswind gust and having full opposite lock in the gravel verge on the right at that speed of 145 odd miles an hour. So that was scintillating stuff, to say the least, you know. But great memories again of the terrific energy and speed of the Phase 3. I loved the Phase 3.
Only 300 of the new Phase 3s were built, but there would be one less after the race. The car driven by the once again unlucky privateer, Bill Brown.
Running in in fourth place in the John Newell entry is Bill Brown. At McPhillamy Park, a burst tyre on Brown's car causes the most horrifying crash ever witnessed at Bathurst.
That accident took place fairly late in the race, as I remember. And Bill, at that stage in the race, I was driving the car as quickly as I could because we had to be, there were so many things to consider. And I used a low-profile Goodyear front, which fouled the ball joints, and you had to be mindful of that. And so you had to try and avoid allowing the car, loading the front tyre walls too heavily in cornering. But, and so at that time of the race, I was concerned to see Bill closing from behind, but I had to discipline myself to allow that to happen because, I mean, you didn't want to be passed. We were racing for track position, and Bill came closer, and over those few laps, as he came from being in the distance in my mirrors to being quite close, I could see along the top of the mountain trails of blue smoke coming off the right front tyre. And I knew that his front tyre, the bag on the tyre was binding on the top ball joint. But of course I had no way of warning anybody. And then in the particular fateful lap, his car just went out of control right behind me, and I saw the whole accident, as much of it as I could, but I could see it was a bad accident. I expected the circuit to be closed next lap round, but it wasn't. We got through. But I saw them assisting Bill out of the car, and I'd hoped that he was all right, but it was a hell of an accident. But from a technical point of view, in my view, it was inevitable. That's the point I'm trying to make. And I knew Bill, and I knew how determined he was, and I was just hoping he'd just ease off on those fast roller coaster curves along the top of the mountain, but it didn't happen. And obviously what happened was that the right front tyre failed, and catastrophic failure because the wall would have been cut through and the car went out of control and he went up the bank and ran along the fence, as we know.
We have a time at about 1 minute 50, and for that we have put on at least 30 gallons of fuel and done 4 complete tyres. He's a very happy man. Every time he comes by, the smile gets bigger.
Timekeeping for Moffat is his wife Pauline, who nowadays regularly carries out this task. Consolidating his grip on the Classic, Moffat has his rivals struggling to keep within range.
I think at one stage we were nearly a lap in front of everybody, and then with about 30 or 40 laps to go, I can't remember exactly, my car started to miss. I stopped and they looked in the fuel tank and changed the filter there. Went out again and it didn't make any difference. So I came in again and they looked at the filter in the carburetor and it was blocked up. They fixed that and away I went again, and I think I finished up 5th or something like that. Moffat won by a lap, and we would have finished a good 1st and 2nd, but it didn't really matter because I think the top 5 or 6 cars were all forwards.
Now in control, Moffat's averaging around 249. There's some close calls for those pressing a little too hard. Moffat has an advantage of almost 2 laps, and barring misfortune, is assured of victory. Barnes and Skelton have taken over 2nd place, and Mackay is close behind. His concentration inflexible, Moffat is in no danger of becoming complacent.
The race ended up being a Ford benefit, with the GTHOs filling 5 of the top 6 places. Alan Moffat claimed pole position and led all the way to take his 2nd Bathurst victory in demoralising style.
Ford entered a 3-car team on many occasions, so just keeping Freddie Gibson at bay was a pretty good start. And that was always a pleasant chore because Freddie and I got along extremely well. John French was the court jester on many occasions, kept us all smiling when we could. But I was aware of my responsibilities to try and win. I was a paid professional driver, and as such, if we were going to get one through, I felt very keenly about trying to do that. Unfortunately, we really did have plenty of opposition from the XU1s if we ever faltered. And although the V8 had its advantages going up Mountain Straight and could haul the mail, as I mentioned, fairly quickly down the straight, it had very lackluster brakes. And it did roll a lot through the corners. And the XU1s were very nippy and very well driven, naturally, with Colin and Peter, and they were always a big threat.
Moffat is a happy man as he approaches Murray's Corner.
After 500 miles, I can assure you this is the happiest turn a driver can make, is this left-hander onto the straight, waiting for the jubilation of his pit crew to give him the wave finishing the race.
Moffat's nearest opponent is over a lap behind, and his overall time of 6 hours, 9 minutes, 49.5 seconds betters the previous record by over 20 minutes.
The Phase 3 was so dominant at Bathurst in 1971, it was the catalyst for a number of changes. One of those was Holden went back to the drawing board after getting hosed by these big thundering V8 Falcons at Bathurst. They signed off on Harry Firth, who was the boss of the Holden dealer team, going off and developing a V8 version of the Tirana XU1. He actually got as far as building a prototype, and GMH were at a point where they were going to manufacture these cars for the 1972 race before, of course, the supercar scare of 1972 scuppered all those plans. But that just shows what an effect that car, the Phase 3, had on the Australian motoring scene. Bathurst was so important in those days that Holden were prepared to sign off on something as crazy as a V8 XU1 Tirana to knock off Ford at Mount Panorama. That's how important Bathurst was.
This is the South Pacific Touring Series, and here's Alan Marks to give us a rundown on the competitors.
Thank you, Bob. The first one we're looking at is Alan Moffat in car number 50, his Gtho Falcon, which got fastest time in practice yesterday. Second on the grid will be Peter Brock in car number 47, the Tirana XU1. And on the grid 3 is John Goss in his Gtho Falcon.
In 1972, the Phase 3 carried on where it had left off the year before, with name drivers like Alan Moffat, Fred Gibson and John Goss continuing to rack up great performances in the car.
And they're rolling. Beautiful start for the first three cars, neck and neck, still holding a position right side by side as they go down the main straight, with one car, number 44C, left on the start line. Picking up the leader, Alan Moffat, as expected, as he goes down into the right-hand corner. Makes his way down around the bottom end of the circuit now, and this is the first lap in the South Pacific Touring Series. John Goss in the Gtho Falcon or Leo Gagan must win the event today to take out the championship. This is the final round, final of 4 rounds held here in Virginia, and Goss or Gagan must take it, must win if they're going to take it out for Fords or Valiants, respectively.
There was a lot of racing to do, and we had limited resources, but often it was frantic. And I can remember that at Oran Park, I competed in the Basiliques 100 marathon, and that was 100 laps of the short circuit at Oran Park on a hot summer night. And I can remember that Brock had pole, and he managed to pull ahead of me in the race, and we just couldn't understand it. Anyway, I drove as hard as I could, and you know, after about 20 laps, I had really no brakes at all, which we expected. But the nature of the circuit was such that you could slide the car into the corner at the end of the straight, and also in a goal coming down off the little the dipper. But I drove on, and I got pretty good at washing the speed off with a slide, you know. And fortunately, we managed to get through on tyres, but we finished a strong second. And later on, actually, the Holden dealer team Commodore was disqualified because it had an illegal camshaft, which they hadn't homologated or whatever it was. So we actually had won it and didn't know it at the time. But at the end of that night, at about 10 o'clock, we had planned to go to Queensland, or hoped to go to Queensland the next day if we'd been able to finish the race for the Gold Coast 300. And so at the end of that night, at 10 o'clock, I worked with my brother Paul, and we loaded a toolbox into the back seat of that car and a spare wheel, and put a handful of chicken wire up each of the side exhaust pipes, 4-inch straight-out pipes. And my brother Paul drove that car overnight to Queensland. But anyway, I hurried home to Rushcutters Bay, slept for a few hours and caught the first TAA flight for Coolangatta. And I remember that night I just had to pack up my driving suit into a small bag, and it was still saturated with perspiration. And got to Queensland the next morning, got down to the circuit, and the car wasn't there at that time. It hadn't arrived, and at 10 a.m. I saw there was and of course you had to enter the circuit. You could only enter the circuit at surface between events, because the circuit crossing went across the track itself. Anyway, at around 10 o'clock, I saw Paul drive across the circuit. I was much relieved, because the 300 was to start at 11 o'clock or something like that. So he brought it straight around to the back of the pits, and Peter Jeffries and the guys at Ford jacked the thing up and changed the brakes all round, discs, pads and shoes and drums at the rear, changed the oil and filter, replaced the air filter. I think they might have put a set of plugs in the thing, dropped her off the jack. I started from the back of the grid and we finished third and flew home that night. So that sort of thing couldn't be done today, you know. So we'd raced in 2 states overnight, and we'd won in New South Wales and came third in Queensland. Wonderful, you know, so they are great memories.
Off the track, however, a political storm was brewing that would kill plans for future improvements to the Falcon Gtho breed. In June 1972, media and political pressure forced the manufacturers to stop building their so-called Bathurst supercars for the road. Holden scrapped plans for its Tirana XU1 V8, as did Ford with its successor to the Phase 3, the XA Gtho Phase 4.
The 1972 supercar scare killed off what would have been the ultimate high-performance Falcon, the XA Gtho Phase 4. You know, when Ford decided to axe the car, the Ford Works team were well advanced with construction of 3 race cars for the 1972 Bathurst 500 race. Now, as you can see, this car was earmarked for Alan Moffat to drive. It's the only one of the 3 that was fully prepared for racing, and it's now owned by David Bowden. Quite simply, the Phase 4 would have been the fastest, the best handling, the safest of all the GTHOs, right down to its signature 15 by 7-inch alloy wheels, which were designed specifically for this car to improve brake cooling and handling. The Phase 4 may have been killed off, but the legend will live forever. There are only 4 cars that fit that description that were built. Ford Special Vehicles, the race team, had started work on 3 race cars, and 1 car went down the production line as a sort of a test run, and that was the only car that was fitted with a GTHO plate. So officially there was 1 production car and 3 race prototypes built, and that was it. 1 has survived, one of the fully prepared, or the only fully prepared race car. David Bowden, the Queensland collector, owns that one. The production car is held in great secrecy by a collector who we hope one day will liberate that car and we can all get to see it. The second race car that was being built for Fred Gibson, that was destroyed. That car was given to Bruce Hodgson, who rallied the car, quite successfully in fact, but it was eventually written off in a road smash. And the third of those 3 race cars that was being built as a spare, that car fortunately survives too. So it's been extraordinary that 3 of those 4 original cars are still around today.
It's going to be a battle royal between these 3 makes of series production cars, the Chrysler Chargers, the Holden XU1s and the Ford GTHOs.
Well, you can see that Colin Bond's got the jump in one of the new XU1s, and thrusting up from the second row of the grid into second place is a very determined Alan Moffat. He's already displaced the white Charger of Doug Chivers, and down the straight I'd say we might see the V8 power starting to perhaps make some impression on the little green Tirana. And there's Bond tucked over on the gate shutters line on the inside, Moffat ranging up on the outside and having to brake much sooner, it would appear. Bond asserting his lead as they whistle down into creek for the first time.
So Ford had no choice but to continue racing the Phase 3. However, with their narrow 14-inch diameter steel wheels, the HOs were starting to suffer some serious tyre trouble in 1972. So some new 15-inch globe alloy wheels which had been developed specially for the Phase 4, were approved for use on the Phase 3s instead, just in time for the Sandown 250, where John Goss led home another GTHO trifecta.
We had reliability and we had enough speed to really stamp our mark on that race, and that was a major event in the lead up to Bathurst, and of course in history it's a major event supporting the Bathurst race philosophically when we look back at that era. So of course I was happy to win that race, and I can remember the Governor of Victoria presenting me with the award and the wonderful ambience at Sandown with sometimes up to 40,000 people in the stands giving us a good old cheerio, you know, good stuff. Yeah, good memories.
So Bathurst 72 saw the 3.3-litre six-cylinder Tirana XU1s up against the more powerful but ageing Phase 3s. Moffat was once again fastest in the dry qualifying session to claim pole position. Beside him was John Goss, and behind them French and Gibson, all in Phase 3s.
Battle of the big three, it's Moffat, leading at the end of lap 1. Second is French. Brock is next in the Tirana, which means Gibson and Goss have slipped back in their Falcons.
However, luck was not with Ford that year. Heavy rain at the start of the race played havoc with their tyre choice.
Here comes French. He must have gone down the escape road at the end of the straight. That shows you how slippery it is, because French is no mean driver.
The first major casualty was Fred Gibson, who lost it in McPhillamy Park and rolled in almost the same spot as the Tirana, once again driven by the unlucky Bill Brown.
The track was being wet, there was a drying line happening, and I was in a hurry because I was trying to make catch up. We're on race tyres, not wet tyres, I think we're on, and you're in the groove, and I was passing a lap car, and what I should have done was stayed behind him till I got round the top of the mountain. I thought, no, I can just sneak past there. He was giving me some room, but he didn't give me enough room, and I got the outside tyres in the wet, and I got out in the wet and just lost it, and she rolled over, you know, and that was bad. But the thing was, those days, one of the funny stories about that was, it's like you talk about Dougie Shivers used to smoke a cigarette drive around Bathurst sort of thing. He used to go past the control down, put his cigarette down sort of thing, and put the cigarette back and drive up the mountain. But the thing is, I used to carry some oranges in a plastic bag in the centre console to have something to eat as you go around, because just keep you know. And the thing is, I roll this thing over and I'm upside down, and all the oranges have come out of the centre console and fell over everywhere. There's all these cut-up square oranges, which we used to cut the oranges up, and they've all fallen everywhere. And then I thought, what do I do? This is my first roll. So I let the seatbelt go and crash on the roof, because your head come down and crashed on the roof. So it was a pretty strange experience, really. Yeah.
Moffat's spot. He's up a bank at Reed Park, near where Bond went.
Ford hopes for Moffat winning his third consecutive Bathurst 500 were not to be. A spin in the early wet running cost him the lead. Then he lost more time with pit lane time penalties and later brake problems.
And here's drama, an unscheduled stop by Moffat. Last time in, he was complaining about the Falcon's brakes, and this could be the reason for him bringing the car in so soon. Yes, it looks as though the mechanics are checking out the systems. No effort to change tyres. No one's worrying about topping up the fuel tanks. I'd say that this stop could develop into a lengthy one. That'll mean the end of Moffat's chances of taking the 500 from Brock. Very disappointing moment for the Ford Works driver.
A driver who would go on to become a Holden racing legend, Peter Brock, won the race in a Tirana XU1. However, at least some pride was salvaged for Ford, with the fine second placing by John French in his distinctive dark purple Phase 3.
It was an extremely good car, and why we went so well there compared with some of the other Fords is that it was a wet Bathurst, and we were having trouble with the locker diff giving us too much oversteer. So before the race, we actually put a different type of diff in it, which is a clutch type diff, and it didn't give you the drive that a locker gave you, and that made us as quick. And we were quite competitive until I got a puncher early in the race and lost a lap. But it was an extremely good motor car. It was a very successful meeting for myself and for Brian Burt Ford, who owned and gave me the opportunity to drive it. But the success at Bathurst wasn't as important as it is today. That was Peter Brock's first win, and he was over the moon about it, because he was just about starting on his professional career, and it was fairly important to him. It was important to me because, well, we finished Bathurst, we'd run second, and it was a lot of fun, and there was a lot of partying after it, but it wasn't the beginning and the end of everything.
Still very close together, and Gagan working hard to try and size up Beachy, try to get through and put Beachy between himself and Bob Jones Camiro. And here he goes now, ranging up inside Beachy, and there's nothing that Beachy can do about it now. He's got
another chapter in the GTHO story was written by Ford a couple of years earlier, when it built two very special cars that were definitely not for public consumption.
Beachy for second position. Gagan well established in the lead, and there goes...
In 1970, the Ford Motor Company of Australia decided to build two very special GTHO Falcons for Alan Moffat and Pete Gagan to drive in the Australian Touring Car Championship. They were called the Super Falcons. They were built using lots of lightweight exotic components and immensely powerful fuel-injected V8 engines. Now, although Moffat chose to stick with his Trans Am Mustang, Pete Gagan persevered with this car, and with a whopping 617 brake horsepower, this car rates as the most powerful improved production car ever built. It also starred in what many fans say was the best touring car race of all time, when it narrowly beat Moffat's Trans Am at Mount Panorama's Bathurst ATCC meeting at Easter 1972.
Now let's look from the straight now, and here they come, and a great conception of speed here, as it's car 1 in front. Ian Gagan has shot through to take the lead from Norm Beachy, and car 7 in third place, that's Bob Jane.
The idea was that Beachy was doing very well in the Monaro in the Australian Touring Car Championship, and Ford Motor Company sold Falcons. They didn't sell Mustangs. So Al Turner, who was the head of the competition department, decided, OK, we need to build some GTHOs that are going to blow Norm Beachy off the face of the map. So they built two cars. One was for Alan Moffat, one was for Pete Gagan. They weren't known as the Super Falcons then, but they've become known just through the incredible folklore and the history around the cars. But these were extraordinary things. Like, in today's money, each one of those cars cost over $1 million to build. 600 horsepower V8 engines, custom-made fuel injection systems, super lightweight panels. I mean, they even went to the extent of putting in magnesium door hinges and titanium wheel nuts. Like, it just went on and on and on and on. The expense was incredible. And these cars were supposed to have just dominated the scene, but they never really delivered on their promise. Once the cars were built, I think the factory tended to step away from the cars a bit, and the development of them was left to Alan Moffat and Pete Gagan. Because Alan Moffat was running the Trans Am, the Boss 302 Mustang, which was a proven winner, he experimented with his Super Falcon, but he could never get that car anywhere near the pace of the Mustang. And as he was running his own business, which was effectively Alan Moffat Racing, he had responsibilities to his sponsor Coca-Cola. There was no way that he could give up the Boss 302 to race the Super Falcon, so ultimately that car was put aside. Pete Gagan, however, his Mustang was getting a bit long in the tooth by the end of '71. It was 5 seasons old, and there really wasn't anything more he could get out of it. So he decided to dedicate himself to developing that car, and he spent an enormous amount of his own money on it, turning it into what eventually became a race winner. Only one championship race win, but it was the best one of all, and that was that race at Bathurst in Easter '72.
Changes to the showroom-based series production rules in 1973 could have meant the end for the Phase 3 as a dominant racing force. However, more liberal modifications allowed under the new Group C production touring regulations that year actually kept the ageing XY Falcon racer at the head of the pack. The final chapter of the GTHO story was fittingly reserved for Alan Moffat, who steered Ford's last Phase 3 campaign in the 1973 Australian Touring Car Championship. The car carrying the number 9 actually started life as a test hack, used by Ford for brake and suspension tuning. It became Moffat's new race car from the 1972 Sandown 250 onwards, and in Group C trim went on to win the 1973 ATCC title in a memorable year-long battle with Peterbrock's Holden Tirana XU1. It was also the first time Moffat had taken the one title that had managed to elude him earlier in his mighty red Trans Am Mustang. It was a fitting finale for Ford's mighty GTHO after 4 years of amazing competition success. There would be new versions of the GT to follow, but the mighty HOs had run their race, leaving behind a proud legacy that will forever be a part of Australian motorsport and muscle car folklore.
At one stage, the GTHO Falcon was the fastest mass-produced four-door sedan in the world. In the world, Now, in the early 1970s, Australia and the Australian motoring industry was just a backwater. You know, it was a pinhead on the map. No one even knew it existed. So for this car, built in Australia, to be the fastest mass-produced four-door sedan in the world was an extraordinary achievement. So I think all those things are what make the car what it is. And I think the Phase 3 particularly is so valuable today because of that shaker scoop sticking through the bonnet. I mean, no other GTHO model had it, and it was an enormously successful car at Bathurst. So you combine those two factors, and it really is it was an instant classic, and its value has only increased year by year.